Phillip. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very, very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very, very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about deconstruction. This is not necessarily a school of critical thought. The sort of creator of deconstruction, Jacques Derrida, would be very, very opposed to the idea of thinking about it as a school of literary criticism. But deconstruction is essentially a mode of reading. It's largely a mode of reading that responds to structuralism. That responds to this idea that meaning can be clearly and effectively defined, right? Because this is the structuralist contention, ultimately, is that by understanding sign systems of signifieds and signifiers, you can comprehend meaning effectively. Derrida comes along and says, but you can't. There's a number of problems with this idea. And so one of the central challenges of deconstruction is to the traditional binary thinking that guides so much of Western philosophy, so much of the traditional approaches to Western thought, Western philosophy, Western reading styles from the ancient Greeks forward. Essentially what Derrida says, that's the big real challenge to this, is meaning always escapes the limitations of the particular text, because text exists within a complex network that makes meaning for it. So it's not a simplistic thing. It's not like you look at the words on a particular piece of paper and their meaning is fixed, direct, and singular. He says that's not what happens with texts, with sign systems, etc., etc. In fact, they explode beyond that. And it's also worth noting, one of Derrida's most famous maxims is there's nothing outside the text. So Derrida actually looks at all ways of making meaning, from, say, literature, from philosophical or scientific or political writing or whatever it is, religious texts, film, television, but also things like the clothing that people wear as a system of fashion, to the ways, to architecture, anything that conveys some kind of meaning. Derrida's central contention is that the potential meanings it conveys are not bounded by the actual message itself, not bounded by the actual medium, not bounded by the actual content. So what does this mean? Well, essentially what this means is that there's always potentially more meaning in a text than someone like a semiotician or a structuralist would be able to capture. in part because of the way that that text creates meaning through networks of engagement with other texts, with other ideas, and with the reader themselves. So one of the big ideas in deconstruction, in Derridian philosophy, is what's called différance, which is a coinage. Derrida and the deconstructionists love making up new words to convey things. Différance is one of them. It comes from the French word différer. I don't speak French, so I'm possibly pronouncing that wrong. But it means something like to defer, postpone, or delay, and to differ or to be different from. So Derrida jams these two definitions together in this new term, to have this new meaning. And basically what différance is hard to really define in a specific key way, but essentially you can think about it as reversing the binaries or undoing the binaries that undergird structuralist thinking, but also that undergird traditional philosophical and literary understandings. Western thinking has a very, very, very long tradition of being binary, of positioning two sides against one another. Derrida sort of comes along and says, but maybe it's not that. So if we think about this in terms of structuralism of semiotics, we have the signifier and the signified, right? The basic assumption of semiotics, or one of the basic assumptions of semiotics, is you have a particular thing that conveys meaning, and you have the particular meaning conveyed. Derrida says, what if it's not that? What if that isn't the way it works? What if you have a signifier that conveys a multitude of meanings? Or what if you have a meaning that escapes its signifier? What if you have a meaning that escapes the particular content or sign that is meant to convey it? So this is the idea here. Let me see if I can give you a good example. So, I don't know that I'm going to be able to come up with a good example right off the top of my head, though I used to have a few examples that worked really well for illustrating this. But so Derrida, a lot of his work actually goes back to the ancient Greeks. For instance, he takes on Plato, and he says, actually, Plato seems to think that he's conveying this singular meaning, but if we read it in a different way, or if we understand it if we understand the words to mean something different, then the meaning is completely changed. And that's not to say if we just make up our own meanings or whatever it is. That's very much not what deconstruction means. But you have words with multiple definitions, and you have words with multiple connotations. And that's a really, really important component of deconstruction. There's a difference between denotation, which is the literal, usually dictionary definition of a word, and connotation, which is the sets of associations that a word has. So one of the things that Derrida would assert is that there's always more associations, more connotations than what an author particularly means. So in Charles E. Bressler's Literary Criticism and Introduction to Theory and Practice, we get a good sort of explanation of what différance, what deconstruction means for literary study. So he says, if we, like Derrida, assert that différance operates in language and therefore also in writing, what are the implications for textual analysis? The most obvious answer is that texts lack presence, Once we do away with the transcendental signified and reverse the presence-absence binary operation, texts can no longer have presence. In isolation, texts cannot possess meaning. In isolation, texts cannot possess meaning. That's a really important point. Since all meaning and knowledge is now based on differences, no text can simply mean one thing. Texts become intertextual. The meaning of a text cannot be ascertained by examining only that particular text. A text's meaning evolves from that derived from the interrelatedness of one text to an interrelatedness of many texts. Like language itself, texts are caught in a dynamic, context-related interchange. Never can we state a text's definitive meaning, for it has no one correct or definitive interpretation. No longer can we declare one interpretation to be right and another wrong, for meaning in a text is always elusive, always dynamic, always transitory. So there's a number of really important points there in terms of what deconstruction brings to the act of critical reading. One is the challenge, the basically abandonment of the new critical idea that a text can be understood in isolation just by looking at the craft of it. So you can't, for instance, look at a poem, say Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death or Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. You can't look just at that text and say, okay, here's the meter, here are the literary devices, etc., etc. Now I know what this means. Derrida comes along, the deconstructionists come along and say, no, that's one meaning. But there are other elements that go into creating meaning, and there's not just the single meaning. There are a number of potential meanings depending on how we see this text in its relationship to other texts. And that, of course, has a reader response component. Because if I read this particular poem and I happen to know this other set of texts, but not this third set of texts, I bring my knowledge of that second set of texts, but I don't bring knowledge of that third set. So the meaning of this poem for me is then conditioned by what I'm familiar with. So there's a reader response element to deconstruction. But again, deconstruction goes beyond this because it says the text itself doesn't have a fixed and stable meaning. What it has is meaning that's generated out of the constellation of other texts and the ways, the strategies that I bring to reading it. So meaning is no longer fixed and stable. Meaning is always in flux. And I think actually a great sort of illustration of this is the idea that if you read a novel at different points in your life, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, I think, is a really common example. Like, people read this at different points in their life and say, well, when I was 18, this meant one thing to me. Then when I read it at 30, it meant something radically different. Then when I read it at 50, it meant something completely different. That's a great example of the kind of textual instability that deconstruction allows us to understand. So let's talk about the implications of this fairly quickly. One great benefit of deconstruction as an approach to reading is it opens up a lot of possibilities. It opens up a lot of potentials, things that we can find in the text based on what we bring to it and how we read it. So this is a liberating philosophy in that sense. It's a liberating approach to critical reading, because if what we bring to a text changes, if the way that we understand that language or the words chosen or whatever it is for that text changes, then we can get new meanings. So it's incredibly generative. One of the big problems with deconstruction, especially the way that Derrida practices deconstruction, is that it kind of is an end in itself. Deconstruction, while especially post-Derridian critics and thinkers do often use deconstruction to explore texts in different ways and to try and draw larger conclusions about the world, because it's premised on this idea that there is no singular stable meaning. There's also no singular stable practice of deconstruction. And so it's often regarded as an extraordinarily challenging philosophy to get your head around, and it's not clear how much we can sort of do with deconstruction beyond saying there's a number of possible meanings encoded in these texts. The other big problem with deconstruction is because deconstructionists have a tendency to make up their own terms to describe complex concepts that are often not necessarily accessibly defined. It is an extraordinarily difficult body of work to deal with philosophically, because what the deconstructionists often mean is not super clearly defined, which of course makes sense because the fundamental contention of deconstruction is you can't really ever define anything clearly because there's so many different factors that go into creating the idea of meaning.